Hi everyone, my name is Yoni Levy. I'm heading the freshly established Empathy Building Neurolab, in which I study empathy, brain, and conflict. And I'm from Aalto University and I IDC Herzliya, so both in Finland and in Israel. And so today I will talk to you about this topic. And basically, I will outline the neural and social determinants of conflict that are reflected through a couple of studies that I conducted in recent years, and also present a neuroscience-based approach for empathy building. So we all know what empathy is, the ability to understand and feel for the other, and we know that also social identity greatly influences our empathy towards others. So whether someone is from our in-group, for instance, ethnic in-group, and or our ethnic out-group, this greatly determines our empathy. And to take the extreme case of intergroup conflicts, this truly shapes empathy. So I would like to begin with these nice illustrations that we recently published in a journal for kids, Frontiers for Young Minds. And I think I would like just to point out this point that when we experience physical pain, it can also be emotional pain. So we have a certain brain response. And research in social neuroscience and in neuroscience actually as well has shown that while we perceive a person in such pain, we have a very similar activation in the brain. So the activation during the perception and during the experience is very similar. And this is, I think, a really nice demonstration of what empathy is. I will really briefly browse a couple of previous research that examined empathy in the brain. So these are the two seminal papers on empathy in the brain. And I just wanted to outline that now, together with Oren Butter, who introduced me actually to this social ontology society, we have submitted a paper on neuro-phenomenological hypothesis of graded empathy. So I'm happy to further discuss it in the future once it's published, because it's very much related to what I outline here. So the first study on intergroup empathy in the brain was in 2009. But here we will use MEG, so it's a very new approach for studying social neuroscience in general, and MEG and intergroup empathy in particular. And the advantage is that it can give us a very rich information on the brain dynamics, in particular on brain rhythms with a very high temporal resolution. So the first study I will present was conducted on Israeli and Palestinian youth, actually Palestinian citizens of Israel, also called the Arab citizens of Israel. And we examined their level of empathy in the brain while they were watching targets in pain, and the targets were either Israelis or Palestinians. So we found in both groups of participants that there was empathy towards the in-group, but not towards the out-group. We then wanted to conduct a more social behavior paradigm in which we divided the Palestinians and Israelis into diets, and we evaluated their levels of hostility based on body language and gaze and tone of voice, etc. And we it was nice to see that there was a correlation, positive correlation between the outgroup hostility and the neural in-group bias. So the more the brain had empathy towards the in-group and not towards the outgroup, the more they had hostility towards the outgroup diet with which they were interacting. The next study was examined how exposure growing up in conflict shapes our ability to empathize. So what we did here, conducted the studies in Israel, but I could select a group that was more exposed to conflict, so around the Gaza Strip, which are the participants there are frequently exposed to war and missile attacks. And the control group was citizens of Tel Aviv and the region around. And we followed them for over a decade, from early childhood, late childhood, and then at pre-adolescence, we measured their level of brain activity and reflecting empathy. So the first finding was actually a no finding, that basically both groups, whether they were highly exposed to conflict or not, they had the ability to empathize with the other, and this was reflected as similar levels of brain activation while perceiving others in social or physical pain. However, we found this extra activity in regions related to mentalization and rumination, and we interpreted this activity as emotional reactivity and basically anxiety and rumination, so not empathy. And the reason for that is we found that the participants that had this extra activation, in early childhood, they tended to have a negative emotional reactivity to distressing situations. So they were more emotionally reactive in a negative way. And these were also only the participants who came from the high exposure region. And also these participants later on in late childhood tended to develop anxiety disorders. So to summarize, so what we saw before, the relation between empathy in the brain and hostility in intergroup conflict, and also the relation between the development of empathy and the development of negative emotional reactivity and anxiety. The second part I would like to abord in this presentation is how can we use this research for the purpose of empathy building. So we conducted a study in which Israeli and Palestinian participants were meeting with each other for a few weeks, and we wanted to measure their level of negativity towards each other before and after the participation. So we used the IAT test, in which we have congruent trials in which there is association between in-group and good and out-group and bad, and in the incongruent trials we have in-group bad and out-group good. This was inspired also by a seminal paper by Bruno and Sachs that studied the IAT and the brain activity in the context of the Israeli-Arab conflict. And Basically, in the incongruent trials, it takes us longer to process this incongruency compared to the congruent trials. So this is reflected as a response time gap, but it can also be reflected as a neural gap. So we conducted here this neural index of IAT, so measuring in the MEG the IAT test. And to make a long story short, we found a very interesting effect in which this neural bias index of the IAT basically tended to disappear after the intervention and not in a control group in which there was no intervention. Virtual reality is a great tool, I think, to increase empathy building, to foster empathy building, because it enables us to, for instance, take the perspective of the other or experience situations that we never have the opportunity to experience in reality. So, and another important advantage, which is actually critical advantage, is that it allows participants to have this experience in 1 minute, for instance. And that's what we did in this study. We created a virtual reality movie, 1 minute movie. And instead of now all the logistics of creating an intergroup intervention, meeting, all these meetings and long process. So we had just 1 minute virtual reality scene. And in this scene, we took the perspective of the Israeli soldiers compared to the Palestinian passengers. I will now simply show you the movie. So as you will see in a few seconds, in this movie, we basically put virtual reality cameras, and we took two movies. So one movie from the Israeli perspective and one movie from the Palestinian perspective. In the first movie that you will see now, you'll see it from the Israeli perspective. And then in the second one, I will let it play for longer. In the second one, we filmed the same movie, but we took it from the Palestinian perspective. One important point that I have to emphasize here is that this demo that you see here is seen as a very regular movie. You see it on a computer screen. However, in reality, and this was taken, this is done with virtual reality headsets. So when I see this actual movie, I actually experience as if I'm actually there in this situation. It's quite mind-blowing. And I will let it play. So as you see, it's a very tense and charged movie, and actually we conducted first a behavioral study, and we saw that Israelis that took this perspective of the Palestinians couple, they had more empathic emotions toward the Palestinian couples, and more importantly, this decreased the dehumanization towards the Palestinian population in general. In the next study that actually is under ongoing, we did the same thing, but measuring the brain activity to understand the mechanisms that are affected by the brain mechanisms that are affected by this VR intervention. To summarize, so we saw these social and neural determinants of conflict, and particularly related to empathy. And then we saw that we can have an empathy building approach, which our two studies already show that it can foster empathy and decrease dehumanization and implicit associations in the brain. And to end, I would like to raise a couple of open questions, the importance of integrating multidisciplinarity, and I think this is particularly relevant for this social ontology meeting. And then my personal interest in looking at how these mechanisms are affected by development. So how they're developed throughout human development from childhood till through adulthood and late age. And also how context affects, how, for instance, cultures, different cultures affect these mechanisms, and perhaps different levels of conflict. So high places like in Israel, where you have high level of conflict compared to Finland, where conflict is much, much more mitigated. It's relatively tensions, but not high conflict at all. And the last but not least question is, can this research actually foster empathy? And I think it's a very big question, and I'm happy to further discuss it. So thank you very much for your interest in this presentation, for following all this. And I'm really happy to take any questions, and to thank, of course, the funders of this research. And also, most of this research has been conducted during my postdoc period. So I would like to thank Ruth Feldman and Ron Alperin and their great labs. And that's it. Thank you very much.